An elderly black woman, Martha, is walking with her grandchildren and son in a peaceful neighborhood park. She's leaning on her cane, her frail body showing signs of her age and disability, but her spirit remains unbroken. The children laugh and play around her, while her son, David, walks quietly by her side. David is tall, dressed in simple, comfortable clothing, trying to enjoy some quality time with his family. What many don't know is that David is the governor of the state, a man who believes in justice and equality for all. Chapter 2. The encounter unfolds. The calm of the afternoon was shattered as Officer Collins stepped out of his patrol car, his heavy boots crunching on the gravel of the parking lot. The sun was still bright, casting long shadows across the ground, but its warmth did little to thaw the cold intensity in Collins' expression. His uniform, pristine and neatly pressed, gleamed in the fading light, a stark contrast to the storm that brewed beneath his calm exterior. David, sensing trouble before the officer even spoke, instinctively positioned himself closer to his mother. He knew this type of situation all too well. The posture, the walk, the hard-set jaw. It was the stance of an officer who had already made up his mind about the people he was approaching. David's heart sank, knowing that despite his status as the governor, in this moment, he was just another black man in a situation that could quickly turn dangerous. Martha, unaware of the looming confrontation, was focused on her grandchildren, watching as they ran around, laughing and playing. She cherished these moments with them, times when she could simply enjoy the innocence of youth without the weight of the world bearing down on her shoulders. But that peace was short-lived. "Hey!" Collins barked, his voice cutting through the air like a whip. "What are you doing here?" David felt a surge of anger rise in his chest, but he swallowed it down. He had dealt with situations like this before, and reacting with anger would only make things worse. Instead, he turned calmly toward the officer, his hands at his sides, palms open, a gesture of non-aggression, one he had learned over the years could sometimes diffuse tension. "We're just out for a walk," David replied evenly, his voice steady. "It's a beautiful day, and we're spending time with family." Collins' eyes narrowed, scrutinizing David as if searching for something that would justify his presence. His gaze then shifted to Martha, who was now looking at him with confusion, and then to the children, who had stopped playing and were watching the scene unfold with wide, uncertain eyes. "I'm gonna need to see some ID," Collins demanded, his tone rough, almost dismissive, as though this was a routine request he made of everyone. Yet David knew that wasn't the case. David hesitated for a moment, the familiar pang of frustration rising in his gut. Why? Why did they always have to prove they belonged? His mind raced, but he stayed calm, reaching into his pocket for his wallet. "Sure, officer. No problem." As David handed his driver's license over, Collins grabbed it with a force that seemed unnecessary, his fingers gripping the card tightly. He glanced at it for a few seconds, then handed it back without so much as an acknowledgement of who David was. Governor or not, Collins had already decided that these people didn't belong here. David's restraint, hard-earned from years of experience, was wearing thin, but he knew he had to maintain control. He turned to his mother, who was still standing silently beside him. "It's all right, Mama," he said quietly, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. But his words couldn't erase the growing tension in the air. "What about her?" Collins asked, jerking his chin toward Martha. "She got ID?" David froze for a moment, the absurdity of the question hitting him like a punch to the gut. His 75-year-old mother, walking with a cane, was being asked to prove she had the right to stand in a public park. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, the anger he had kept at bay beginning to bubble up. "She's my mother," David said firmly, struggling to keep his voice even. "She doesn't carry ID when she's out for a walk." Collins took a step forward, his eyes hardening, his hand now resting on the baton at his hip. "That's not what I asked," he said, his voice low, laced with menace. "I asked if she's got ID." Martha, sensing the shift in the officer's tone, straightened herself despite the pain in her joints. She looked Collins squarely in the eye, her voice calm but unwavering. "I don't have ID on me, officer. I didn't think I'd need it to walk with my son and grandchildren in the park." Colin's lips curled into a sneer, and before David could say another word, the officer reached out and grabbed Martha's arm. It was a sudden, violent motion, one that made David's heart skip a beat and caused Martha to gasp in pain. She stumbled, her cane slipping from her grasp as Collins pulled her toward him with a force that was completely unnecessary. "Get your hands off her," David shouted, his voice rising for the first time, his calm demeanor finally cracking as he moved toward his mother. But Collins was faster. With a swift, practiced motion, he shoved David back with one hand, sending him stumbling a few steps backward. "Stay back," Collins snarled, his hand now fully gripping the baton at his side. Maya and Isaiah screamed, their young voices filled with terror as they watched their grandmother being hurt and their father pushed aside. Tears streamed down their faces, and they clung to each other, unsure of what to do but instinctively knowing something was very wrong. David's heart raced, his mind spinning as he tried to calculate his next move. He knew that escalating the situation could end in disaster. He had seen it before, how these encounters could spiral out of control, leaving devastation in their wake. But the sight of his mother, struggling in the grip of a man who had no right to touch her, filled him with a rage he hadn't felt in years. "Please," David said, his voice strained with emotion. "She's an old woman. Let her go." But Collins wasn't listening. He was too far gone, too consumed by his need to assert power in this situation. To him, David's words were just noise, background to the narrative he had already written in his mind. He tightened his grip on Martha, ignoring her pained expression, ignoring the tears in the eyes of the children standing just feet away. Suddenly, more sirens filled the air, their piercing wails cutting through the chaos. 2 additional patrol cars screeched into the parking lot, their tires kicking up gravel as they came to a stop. Officers jumped out of the vehicles, rushing toward the scene. One of them, Officer Hernandez, recognized David immediately. His face changed as he processed what he was seeing. "Governor David?" he asked in shock, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. The name hit the air like a bomb. Collins, his hand still gripping Martha, froze. His eyes widened slightly as the reality of the situation began to dawn on him. "Governor?" His mind raced, trying to piece together the mistake he had just made. David didn't move. His breathing was heavy, his body trembling with a mixture of rage and fear. He locked eyes with Collins, and for the first time, Collins looked uncertain, his earlier aggression faltering. The backup officers, now fully aware of the gravity of the situation, moved in to de-escalate, gently pulling Collins back and helping Martha to her feet. David rushed to his mother's side, his hands shaking as he helped her stand. "It's over, Mama," David whispered, though his voice was filled with a sadness that told her it wasn't over. Not really. Collins stood frozen, his face pale as the weight of what he had done settled over him like a dark cloud. He had made a terrible mistake, and there was no undoing it now. Part 3. Brutality Unleashed. The air was thick with tension. David stood a few feet from his mother, his heart pounding, trying to make sense of the violence unfolding in front of him. Officer Collins had crossed a line, one that wasn't just about enforcing the law. This was about control, power, and deep-seated prejudice that had exploded in the worst possible way. Martha lay on the ground, her face contorted in pain. Her cane had fallen several feet away, and her body trembled with the shock of what had just happened. The bright, sunlit park, so peaceful just moments before, was now filled with the sounds of chaos. Maya and Isaiah's cries cut through the air, the terror on their young faces unmistakable. They were too young to understand the full scope of what was happening, but old enough to feel the fear and confusion that came with watching their grandmother being hurt. David's mind raced. His instinct as both a father and a son was to rush to his mother's side, to protect her from further harm, but he knew that any sudden movement could provoke Officer Collins into more violence. He had seen it too many times. Situations like this where things spiraled out of control because of a perceived threat, where black men and women were treated as less than human. His fists clenched, every muscle in his body tense, as he fought the urge to act out of anger. "Please, stop this," David said, his voice firm but desperate, trying to keep calm despite the fire burning inside him. He had always been good at controlling his emotions, a skill honed from years of navigating a world where black men had to be twice as composed to avoid being labeled a threat. But today, watching his mother, an elderly, disabled woman, on the ground, gasping for air, it was almost impossible. Collins, his face now flushed with anger and confusion, wasn't listening. His mind was clouded, his actions driven by something far deeper than the immediate situation. He had long harbored resentment toward the idea that he needed to treat certain people differently. To him, the badge he wore gave him the right to assert dominance, to control, and to punish, especially when those he targeted didn't look like him. "Stay back," Collins barked, pulling his baton fully from its holster and pointing it toward David in a threatening gesture. The glint of the metal in the sunlight was menacing, a symbol of the power he held in that moment. David raised his hands, palms open, in a gesture of submission. "You don't need to do this. She's my mother, and she's hurt. Please, just let me help her." But Collins' eyes were locked on David's movements, his grip tightening on the baton. The officer's body language spoke volumes. He was prepared to use force again, despite the clear lack of any real threat. In his mind, David's calm voice and measured actions were nothing more than defiance, and defiance was something Collins couldn't tolerate. Meanwhile, Martha tried to move, her body racked with pain. Her frail hands pushed against the ground, her arms trembling as she struggled to sit up. The sound of her grandchildren sobbing nearby only added to her anguish, but she was too weak to comfort them. She had lived through so much in her life: racism, poverty, hardship, but nothing had prepared her for this moment, where her dignity was stripped away by the very people sworn to protect. "David, please," she whispered, her voice shaky and weak, barely able to form the words. She wasn't calling for help, she was asking for him to stay safe. Martha knew that if David made the wrong move, Collins would lash out, and she couldn't bear the thought of losing her son to the same violence that had scarred so many other families. David's heart broke at the sound of her voice, at the sight of his proud, strong mother reduced to this. But he knew he couldn't rush to her side, not with Collins standing over them, weapon in hand. He had to think, had to find a way to end this without anyone else getting hurt. Collins, breathing heavily now, seemed to hesitate for a moment, as if he were reconsidering his next move. But the hesitation was brief. With his free hand, he reached for the radio on his shoulder, calling in backup, requesting additional units. "Possible assault in progress," he said into the mic, his voice cold and detached, completely ignoring the reality of the situation. The narrative he was spinning for himself was clear. He was the one in control, and David and Martha were the aggressors, the ones who had somehow forced his hand. David watched as Collins continued his charade, realizing that the officer was trying to build a story that would justify the violence already committed. In the eyes of the law, perception was everything, and Collins knew how to manipulate it. The more backup he called, the more it would appear as though David's family had been the problem. But just as the situation seemed to be spiraling further into darkness, the sound of additional sirens filled the air. Several police cars pulled into the parking lot, their lights flashing. For a brief moment, David felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, someone would step in and stop this madness before it got worse. As the other officers approached, David saw one of them, a younger man, Officer Hernandez, recognize him. Hernandez's face changed from the neutral, professional demeanor he had been trained to maintain to one of shock and disbelief. "Governor David?" Hernandez asked, his voice filled with surprise. He had met David once before at a community event and couldn't believe what he was seeing. This was the governor, a man known for his work in improving relations between the police and communities of color, a man who had always advocated for peaceful reform. And here he was, being treated like a common criminal. The other officers, hearing Hernandez's words, froze for a moment. They hadn't realized who they were dealing with. To them, this had been another routine call, a disturbance involving a black family in the park. But now, the gravity of the situation hit them. Officer Collins, still standing over Martha, looked confused, his face turning pale as he processed what Hernandez had just said. "Governor?" Collins muttered under his breath, his grip on the baton loosening slightly. He hadn't recognized David before, hadn't cared to, but now that the title had been spoken aloud, the weight of what he had done began to sink in. The other officers quickly moved in, pulling Collins aside and creating space between him and David's family. Martha, still on the ground, was helped up by one of the other officers, who gently handed her the cane she had dropped. David rushed to his mother's side, kneeling next to her. He held her hand tightly, his heart still racing, but now with a different kind of intensity, one of relief that, at least for the moment, the violence had stopped. "Mama, are you okay?" David asked, his voice filled with concern as he looked into her eyes. Martha nodded weakly, though the pain was still evident in her face. "I'm okay, baby," she whispered, her hand gripping his tightly. But the truth was, the damage had already been done, emotionally and physically. Officer Collins, standing off to the side, looked lost. His face, once hard and filled with aggression, was now pale, his expression one of shock and regret. He had made a mistake that could cost him everything. The weight of his actions hung heavily in the air, and for the first time that day, Collins looked unsure of himself. His bravado was gone, replaced by the cold reality of what he had done. Chapter 4: The Aftermath. The park was eerily quiet as the remaining officers stood around in stunned silence. Officer Collins, who had just been pulled back from the brink of an irreversible mistake, was standing rigid, his face drained of color. The realization of what he had done, and more importantly, who he had done it to, was starting to sink in. David held his mother close, helping her back to her feet, as the weight of the entire situation hung heavily over them all. Martha was still shaken, though she tried to compose herself for the sake of her grandchildren, who were visibly distressed. Maya and Isaiah stood frozen near a bench, tears still streaming down their faces, clinging to each other as if trying to draw strength from one another. Their innocent, playful afternoon had been violently transformed into something they would never forget. The sight of their grandmother being hurt, of their father being pushed away, those memories would stay with them, shaping their understanding of the world in a way no child should have to experience. David, his arm protectively around Martha, could feel the rage still burning inside him. But his focus now was on his mother and children. The anger, the desire for justice, it would come later. Right now, he had to ensure that his family was safe, that his mother got the medical attention she needed, and that his children could be taken away from this nightmare. Officer Hernandez, still standing a few feet away, was doing his best to maintain control over the situation. He had been horrified by what he had witnessed, the blatant abuse of power from Collins, the officer he had once respected. Now, he was faced with the reality that this had been no misunderstanding. Collins had targeted this family, and he had done so with a viciousness that couldn't be explained away. "Governor, we'll get medical assistance for your mother," Hernandez said, his voice steady but tinged with shame for what had just transpired. "I'm so sorry about all of this. We'll make sure she's taken care of." David nodded, but didn't respond immediately. His mind was racing with thoughts of what had just happened and the consequences that were sure to follow. As the governor of the state, he knew this would become a media storm. His family had just been victimized in broad daylight by the very system he had spent years trying to reform. The irony was bitter, and the pain even sharper. Martha, still leaning on David for support, finally spoke, her voice soft but filled with an unshakable resolve. "I don't need an ambulance," she said, waving off Hernandez's offer. "What I need is for my son and these babies to be safe. That's all I've ever wanted." Hernandez looked down, his face tight with guilt. He knew what she meant. There was a deeper pain here, one that stretched back generations, and no amount of medical attention could fix it. Officer Collins, standing off to the side, had begun to process the full weight of his actions. He looked at David, then at Martha, and finally down at his own hands, which had so recently gripped Martha with unnecessary force. The badge he wore on his chest felt heavier now, almost suffocating. For years, he had justified his behavior with the belief that he was protecting the community, upholding the law. But today, he had crossed a line. One that he couldn't justify, not to himself, and certainly not to anyone else. Collins started to speak, but his voice faltered. He had no words to explain what he had done. There was no apology that would be sufficient. His career, his reputation, everything he had built his life around was crumbling before him, and the regret was starting to crush him. David glanced over at Collins, his expression hard. He didn't have any sympathy for the man at that moment. Collins had made his choice, and now he would have to face the consequences. But that didn't mean David was going to allow his family to be used as pawns in whatever twisted narrative would inevitably arise. "You're done," David said flatly, his voice cold and final. "You'll never wear that badge again." Collins flinched at David's words, the truth of them hitting him like a physical blow. He knew David was right. There would be no coming back from this. He would be suspended, investigated, likely fired. And even if he wasn't, his name would be all over the news. The public would know him as the officer who assaulted the mother of the governor. The fallout would be swift, and it would be brutal. But for Collins, the most painful part wasn't the loss of his career. It was the realization that he had become the very thing he had once sworn to fight. He had allowed his biases, his anger, and his sense of superiority to consume him, and in doing so, he had destroyed not just his own life, but the trust of the community he had been tasked with protecting. Hernandez, sensing the tension between David and Collins, quickly stepped in. "We're going to take care of this," he said, his tone firm but respectful. "Collins will be removed from duty immediately, and there will be a full investigation. I'll personally see to it." David gave a short nod, though his eyes never left Collins. There was a part of him that wanted to see the man punished more severely, to face the same kind of helplessness and fear that his family had felt. But David was also a man of principle, a man who had always believed in justice, not vengeance. He wouldn't let his anger consume him the way it had consumed Collins. "I'll be holding a press conference later today," David said, turning to Hernandez. "This doesn't stay quiet. The people need to know what happened here." Hernandez nodded in agreement, knowing that the story would be out one way or another. Better that it came from the governor himself than from rumors or distorted reports. David turned his attention back to his children, who were still huddled together, their small bodies trembling with the aftershocks of what they had witnessed. He knelt down in front of them, his voice soft and reassuring. "It's going to be okay," he whispered, pulling them into his arms. "I'm here. We're going home." The park, once a place of joy and relaxation, had become a scene of trauma and pain. As David helped his family back toward their car, the gravity of what had happened settled deep in his chest. This wasn't over. The battle for justice, for accountability, for change, it had only just begun. Chapter 5. A Reckoning and a Call for Justice. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting long shadows across the park where just hours before, David and his family had been enjoying a peaceful afternoon. Now, the serenity of that moment felt like a distant memory. The scene that had unfolded was burned into their minds, leaving behind wounds both visible and invisible. As David drove his family home, the weight of the day pressed heavily on him. Martha sat quietly in the passenger seat, her frail body still recovering from the physical assault, while Maya and Isaiah, unusually silent, sat in the back seat. Their tear-streaked faces stared out the window, as though they were trying to process what had happened but didn't have the words to express the fear and confusion they felt. David could sense their emotional turmoil, but he wasn't sure how to comfort them just yet. He was too consumed with his own thoughts of what needed to happen next. He had spent his entire career trying to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the communities they were supposed to serve. As governor, he had pushed for reforms, better training, community oversight, increased transparency. But today had shown him that no matter how many policies were put in place, there was still a deep-rooted issue at the heart of policing. His own family had become victims of the very system he had sought to improve. When they arrived home, David helped Martha inside, gently guiding her to her favorite chair in the living room. She winced as she sat down, the pain from the rough handling by Officer Collins still evident on her face. Maya and Isaiah clung to her side, their small hands holding onto her as if to protect her from any further harm. David watched the scene, his heart breaking as he saw the fear and uncertainty in his children's eyes. He knew that this incident would leave a mark on them, shaping the way they saw the world from now on. "Daddy, why did that man hurt Grandma?" Maya asked, her voice small and trembling. David took a deep breath, kneeling down in front of his daughter and taking her hands in his. "Sometimes, people in positions of power do things that are wrong," he began, struggling to find the right words. "That officer made a terrible mistake. He hurt Grandma, and that's not okay. But we're going to make sure that people know what happened, and that man will be held responsible for what he did." Maya looked at him with wide, questioning eyes. "But you're the governor. Can't you stop people like him from doing bad things?" David's chest tightened at the innocence of her question. If only it were that simple. He had spent years fighting for change, but days like today reminded him of how far they still had to go. He didn't have all the answers, but he did know that he couldn't let this incident go without a fight. His family wasn't just another statistic in a long list of abuses. He had the platform, the voice, and the responsibility to demand justice, not just for his mother, but for everyone who had been wronged by the system. Later that evening, after making sure his mother was resting comfortably and his children were settled, David retreated to his office. He needed to plan his next steps. A press conference was necessary. The public had to know what had happened. And more than that, real accountability had to be enforced, starting with Officer Collins. There was no room for leniency in a case like this. Too often, officers got away with a slap on the wrist, and that only perpetuated the cycle of violence and mistrust between the police and the community. David's phone buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. It was his chief of staff, Maria, calling to check in. "David, I just heard about what happened. Are you and your family okay?" Maria's voice was filled with concern. "We're shaken, but we're okay for now," David replied, rubbing his forehead. "Mama's resting, and the kids are still scared, but we'll get through this." "I can't believe it," Maria said, her voice heavy with disbelief. "An officer assaulted your mother? Do they even realize who they're dealing with?" "That's part of the problem, Maria," David said, his voice growing more frustrated. "It shouldn't matter who she is or who I am. The fact that it happened at all is what's wrong. That officer saw an elderly black woman and decided she didn't deserve respect or dignity. That's the reality we're dealing with." There was a long pause on the other end of the line before Maria spoke again. "What's the plan? You know this is going to be all over the news by morning." David sighed. "I'm going to hold a press conference. We need to get ahead of this, tell our side of the story before the police try to spin it. I want full accountability for Collins. He can't walk away from this with a suspension and a quiet reassignment. We're going to make an example out of him." "I agree," Maria said. "I'll start organizing everything. We'll have the press there by noon tomorrow. You need to be ready, David. This is going to be a national story." "I know," David said, his voice steady but filled with determination. "I'm ready." The next morning, the atmosphere at the press conference was tense. Reporters from local and national outlets had gathered, their cameras and microphones trained on the podium where David was about to speak. The air was thick with anticipation, as everyone knew this wasn't just another political speech. This was personal. David stood tall at the podium, his face calm but resolute. Behind him, a large photograph of his mother, Martha, smiling with her grandchildren, was displayed. The image of her bruised face, the result of Officer Collins' actions, had been shared across social media overnight, sparking outrage and demands for justice. He cleared his throat and began to speak. "Good morning, and thank you all for being here. Yesterday, my family experienced firsthand the kind of abuse and violence that too many people in our state and in our country face on a daily basis. My mother, Martha, a 75-year-old disabled woman, was brutally assaulted by a police officer while out for a walk with her family. My children, Maya and Isaiah, witnessed their grandmother being treated with such cruelty that it will forever be etched in their memories." David paused, his voice steady but full of emotion. "As governor, I have always believed in the importance of law enforcement, but I also believe in accountability. And when those who are sworn to protect and serve us fail in their duty, when they use their power to harm rather than help, there must be consequences." He continued, his words gaining momentum. "Officer Collins' actions were not just a violation of my family's rights. They were a violation of the very principles of justice and equality that this country is supposed to stand for. I am calling for a full investigation into his conduct, and I demand that he be held accountable for his actions. We cannot allow this kind of behavior to go unchecked, and we cannot allow our communities to live in fear of those who are supposed to protect them. David looked out into the crowd of reporters, their faces a mixture of anger and sympathy. He knew that this story would resonate far beyond the borders of his state. This wasn't just about his mother. This was about the countless other victims who never had the chance to tell their story. As governor, I am also calling for a statewide review of our police training and accountability systems. We must ensure that incidents like this do not happen again. We need to rebuild the trust between law enforcement and the communities they serve, and that starts with transparency, oversight, and accountability. David's voice softened as he prepared to close. This is a painful moment for me and my family, but it's also a moment of reckoning. We can no longer turn a blind eye to the systemic issues that allow this kind of violence to continue. We must confront it head-on, and we must demand change. Not just for my mother, but for every mother, father, and child who has suffered because of these injustices. He stepped away from the podium, the crowd of reporters immediately launching into questions. But David didn't stay to answer them. He had said what needed to be said, and now the next steps were in motion. He walked off the stage, his mind already turning to the fight ahead. Over the next few days, the story dominated headlines across the country. Protests erupted in cities, with demonstrators demanding justice not only for Martha but for all the victims of police violence. Social media was flooded with messages of support for David and his family, as well as calls for reforms in the police department. Officer Collins was suspended pending the investigation, but for David, that wasn't enough. He knew the system well, and he wasn't going to let this be swept under the rug. He would use every resource at his disposal to ensure that Collins faced the full weight of the law. But beyond the immediate fight for justice, David knew that this was just the beginning of a much larger battle. The fight for police reform, for accountability, and for real, lasting change in the way communities of color were treated. It was a fight that had been going on for generations, and now, it was his turn to carry the torch. David returned home that evening, exhausted but resolute. His mother was resting, his children were safe, and his family, despite everything, was still standing strong. He knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but he also knew that he couldn't turn back now. This was more than personal. This was a fight for justice, and David was ready to see it through to the end. The days following the press conference were a whirlwind for David and his family. His mother, Martha, was still recovering physically, but emotionally, she had grown stronger. She refused to let the pain break her spirit. She had seen worse in her lifetime. And while this incident brought back painful memories, it also reignited a fire within her. Martha had lived through the civil rights movement, witnessed the rise and fall of leaders who fought for justice, and now, as the mother of a governor, she found herself at the center of yet another battle. For David, the time had come to shift from words to action. His press conference had galvanized public support, but now came the real test. Ensuring that Officer Collins faced the consequences of his actions, while simultaneously working to implement long-lasting reforms. The situation had gone far beyond personal. It had become a matter of state and national importance. The spotlight was on him, and David knew that failure was not an option. The first step was dealing with the internal police investigation. David had demanded a full, independent review of the incident, and within 24 hours of the press conference, Collins had been placed on administrative leave. That wasn't enough for David. He wanted Collins held accountable, not protected by the blue wall of silence that too often shielded bad officers from justice. David's legal team worked around the clock, pushing for Collins' immediate arrest. Meanwhile, he began forming alliances with local civil rights organizations, grassroots movements, and prominent activists. He knew that the key to systemic change was a coalition of voices. His alone wouldn't be enough. The evening after the press conference, David sat at his desk, reviewing the reports and emails pouring in from various sources. His chief of staff, Maria, sat across from him, her fingers flying across her keyboard as she coordinated with multiple agencies. "David, we've got calls coming in from the NAACP, Black Lives Matter, and a number of local community groups. They're all offering their support, Maria said, glancing up briefly. There's also word that Collins has hired a lawyer and is preparing his defense. You need to be ready for a fight. David leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. He had expected resistance, but it still weighed heavily on him. Collins was going to fight back, and it wouldn't be easy to hold him accountable, especially with the police union already making noise about due process and protecting officers from unfair treatment. David had no problem with due process, but he knew how these situations often played out: delays, deflections, and ultimately, no real consequences for the officer involved. I'm ready for whatever they throw at us, David replied, his voice low but determined. We can't let this become another case where the officer walks away without facing justice. My mother deserves better. The people deserve better. Maria nodded in agreement, but there was concern in her eyes. The police union is going to push hard, and you know they'll frame this as a political attack on law enforcement. We need to make sure we have solid evidence and a clear strategy moving forward. David nodded. We'll focus on the facts. This isn't about attacking all cops. It's about holding one man accountable for his actions. If we stick to that message, we can counter their narrative. He knew the stakes were high. As governor, he had to navigate the delicate balance between supporting law enforcement and ensuring justice for his mother and other victims of police brutality. The political implications were significant, but David was willing to risk it all. He had made his choice. He would fight for justice, even if it meant alienating some powerful groups along the way. 2 weeks later, the investigation into Collins' actions had concluded. The findings were damning. Multiple eyewitnesses had come forward, including bystanders who had recorded the incident on their phones. The footage showed Collins' aggressive behavior, the excessive force he used against Martha, and the way he ignored David's attempts to defuse the situation. The case against Collins was strong. The district attorney's office announced that they would be filing charges against Collins for assault and abuse of power. It was a small victory, but it was only the beginning. Collins' lawyer had already begun spinning a defense, claiming that Collins had acted within the bounds of his training and that he hadn't realized who Martha was. It was the same old story, an attempt to justify brutality by blaming a lack of information or claiming that the officer had feared for his safety. David wasn't having any of it. The truth was clear. Collins had seen an elderly black woman and her family and made a series of assumptions based on their race. He had acted on those assumptions, and now he had to face the consequences. The trial of Officer Collins became a media spectacle. News outlets from across the country covered the proceedings, and every moment was analyzed and dissected by commentators and pundits. On one side were those who supported David and his family, calling for justice not only for Martha but for all victims of police violence. On the other side were those who defended Collins, framing him as a good cop who had made a mistake in a high-pressure situation. The divide was stark, and the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Martha attended the trial every day, her head held high despite the emotional toll it took on her. David sat beside her, his presence a silent but powerful reminder of the stakes. This wasn't just about one incident. It was about changing a system that had allowed too many officers like Collins to act with impunity. The prosecution built a strong case, relying heavily on the video evidence and eyewitness testimony. They painted a clear picture of Collins as a man who had let his prejudices and power go unchecked. The defense, meanwhile, tried to cast doubt on the intentions of the witnesses and argued that Collins had been following protocol in a difficult situation. As the trial progressed, the public's interest only grew. Protests erupted outside the courthouse, with demonstrators holding signs that read, "Justice for Martha" and "End Police Brutality." The movement for police reform, which had been simmering for years, gained new momentum. David used his platform to push for legislative changes, introducing bills aimed at increasing police accountability, banning chokeholds, and mandating de-escalation training for all officers. But even as he fought for change in the halls of power, David couldn't shake the weight of the personal battle he was waging in the courtroom. This was his mother, his family, that had been hurt, and no matter how much progress they made on a systemic level, he knew that real healing wouldn't begin until Collins was held accountable for his actions. The turning point in the trial came when Collins himself took the stand. His testimony was critical to his defense, and everyone in the courtroom held their breath as he began to speak. Collins appeared nervous, his usual bravado noticeably absent. He recounted the events of that day, trying to paint himself as a man caught in a chaotic situation. He claimed that he hadn't intended to hurt Martha, that he had been trying to maintain control and protect himself. But as he spoke, it became clear that his version of events didn't match the evidence. The prosecution cross-examined Collins, pressing him on why he had singled out Martha and why he had ignored David's attempts to intervene. They played the video footage again, showing the moment when Collins had grabbed Martha, despite her clear inability to pose any threat. Collins faltered under the pressure, his answers becoming more evasive and contradictory. David watched from his seat, his jaw clenched. He could see that Collins was crumbling, but he also knew that juries could be unpredictable. It wasn't enough for Collins to come across as confused or mistaken. He needed to be seen as culpable. The defense had tried to frame Collins as a good cop who had made a bad decision, but David knew that this was about more than one bad decision. It was about a pattern of behavior that had gone unchecked for far too long. As the trial neared its conclusion, the mood in the courtroom shifted. The weight of the evidence was impossible to ignore, and the defense's arguments had grown increasingly flimsy. The closing statements were a final chance for both sides to make their case. The prosecution delivered a powerful argument, reminding the jury of the trauma that Martha had endured and the clear abuse of power that Collins had demonstrated. They emphasized that this wasn't just about one incident, but about the larger issue of police accountability. They urged the jury to send a message that officers could not act with impunity, especially when their actions were rooted in prejudice. The defense, on the other hand, tried once again to humanize Collins, portraying him as a man who had dedicated his life to protecting his community. They asked the jury to consider the pressures that police officers faced and to show leniency for what they framed as a tragic mistake. When the jury was finally dismissed to deliberate, the tension in the courtroom was unbearable. David sat with his mother, holding her hand as they waited. He had fought for justice every step of the way, but now it was out of his hands. All they could do was wait. The jury deliberated for 2 days, each hour stretching into what felt like an eternity. Reporters camped outside the courthouse, speculating on the outcome. Across the country, people followed the trial closely, knowing that the verdict would have far-reaching implications. This was more than a trial. It was a test of the justice system itself. Finally, the jury returned with their verdict. David's heart pounded as the foreman stood and read the decision. On the charge of aggravated assault, we find the defendant, Officer Collins, guilty. A wave of emotion swept through the courtroom. Martha let out a small sob of relief, and David squeezed her hand tightly. The weight that had been pressing down